Hello there, Anshul here, and we are back with our macroeconomic unit. This unit is about economic indicators in the business cycle. However, in today's lesson, we will focus on GDP and the business cycle. We have a lot to cover, so let's begin. So we're going to start with GDP, which I'm sure you know already. It stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it is defined as the monetary value of all finished goods and services made within a country in a specific period. GDP helps us analyze the economy and size up different economies. It is used in the same way how you might use the market cap of a company to figure out how big it is. Looking at the finished goods and services part, that's where we start to get into the specifics of the figure. Finished goods mean goods that will not be sold again. For instance, if a restaurant buys an apple, then it isn't considered a finished good because the restaurant will probably sell it through the food they make. However, if you buy an apple or you buy a dish containing an apple from a restaurant, that is considered a finished good because it won't be resold as part of another thing. GDP also contains capital goods like equipment, the reasoning being that they are not sold as part of another good. For a quick reminder, capital goods are goods that are used in producing other goods. But there are limitations to GDP. It doesn't include securities like stocks and bonds, it doesn't include transactions where the good isn't finished, and it doesn't cover used goods or unpaid/illegal transactions. You will also hear the terms nominal and real GDP. Real GDP is adjusted for inflation, since inflation drives up prices and as a result could artificially increase GDP. Remember, an increase in prices due to inflation is not true economic growth. It is just movement along the business cycle, which we will talk about later. Nominal GDP, on the other hand, is not adjusted for inflation. GDP has been the industry standard for decades, but there are other figures to measuring the economy. There is GNI, or Gross National Income. GNI is essentially the GDP of nationals. It counts remittance along with this, which is money citizens of a country send home when they are working abroad. Big companies also outsource their work to other countries because of tax laws or cheaper costs. GDP and GNI could be very different in certain countries. For example, the GDP of Luxembourg in 2014 was 65.7 billion, while the GNI was only 43.2 billion. This happened because a lot of foreign countries operated in Luxembourg because of its lenient tax laws. In East Timor, GNI is almost 4 times GDP. GNP, which is the standard before GDP, stands for Gross National Product. It is an in-between between GDP and GNI. It is the GDP of all Americans, domestic or abroad. Because GDP is the standard, that is what we use in economics and what we will be using for the rest of this unit. Not only are there different ways to analyze the economy, but within GDP there are different ways to calculate it. Now I know what you're thinking, more to memorize, but don't worry, it's easier than you think. The expenditure approach is the first and main way to calculate GDP. This is an extremely important equation because it answers the question of what factors influence economic output, so you should memorize this and have to if you're taking a test. A lot of questions will ask you, if this happens, does that cause a shock, or what does that do to GDP, and things like that. The equation is Y, representing GDP, equals C plus I plus G plus NX. These 4 variables represent the entities that buy things in an economy. C is for consumers, consumer spending. I is for firms, investment spending. G is for government, government spending. And NX is for net exports, which is exports minus imports. One thing to know about the variable G in this equation is that it does not include transfer payments. A transfer payment is income received where no goods or services are being paid for. Subsidies like welfare or bailouts are examples of transfer payments and are not counted in GDP. Another approach is the income approach, which is basically the same as GDP, but instead of calculating all the spending, you're basically calculating all the income. Because one person's spending is another person's income, this makes sense. The equation for the income approach is Y equals W plus R plus I plus PR. All these 4 variables represent the income earned from the factors of production. W represents wages, the income earned for your labor. R represents rental income, the income earned from land. I represents interest income, the income earned from capital. And finally, PR represents profits, income from entrepreneurship. Finally is the value-added approach, which sums up the value added at each stage of the production process. Let's see an example to see how all these work. If I have a shirt, which I spend $5 on the materials for making and sell it for $15, then GDP is $15. Through the expenditure approach, consumer spending is $15 because someone spent $15 for the shirt. Because our whole economy is just this one shirt, we're assuming, then GDP is $15. The $5 spent isn't counted because the material wasn't a finished good. Through the income approach, the $5 profit from the person who sold me the materials plus the $10 profit from me selling the shirt for $15 adds up to the PR variable being $15, so GDP is $15. In the value-added approach, the person who sold me the material added $5 to the value of the material, and I added $10 when I sold it as a shirt. That also adds up to $15. So you can see that in all the approaches, GDP is the same, $15. Alright, so now we covered some ways to measure the economy through numbers, but now let's analyze a graph, the business cycle. There are 4 phases of the business cycle: the peak, the trial, the expansion, and the contraction. The names are pretty self-evident, but the peak and trial are the highest and lowest points of the cycle respectively. The expansion is when the economy is growing from the trough to the peak, and the contraction is the opposite. Now, Ray Dalio has made a great video on the short and long-term debt cycle, which I will link below. I'm basically going to summarize it here, but there are 3 different graphs really that form the business cycle. There's productivity growth, which doesn't really change. It is upward sloping as the economy grows over time. This is very long-term. Then is the short-term debt cycle, which most of us see daily. The stock market, short-term bull and bear markets, this cycle is every 5 to 8 years on average, and it is fueled by credit. Credit is basically debt, and debt is essentially borrowing money from your future self because you get money now that your future self will have to pay for later. As a result, we have cycles. In periods where people aren't burdened with debts, borrowing is high, the economy grows. Because people have more money, they're spending more. That leads to demand pull inflation, which we will cover later in this unit. In addition, because people now have more money, they put that money into banks. Now those banks have more money to lend, since they are only required to keep a certain amount in reserves. We will explore this effect in future lessons. The economy is doing well, but to prevent the economy from overheating, the central bank has to cool things down with contractionary policy, which we will also cover later. This stuff builds off each other, I'm telling you. But what they do is that they increase interest rates, which discourages borrowing. People now have to start worrying more about their debts, so they stop spending as much and allocate more to paying them off. The economy goes down, but to prevent a recession, the central bank once again lowers the interest rate to promote borrowing and increase economic growth, and thus the cycle repeats. Now, the long-term debt cycle occurs every 75 to 100 years. These are our 1929 and 2008s. Those being the troughs of the long-term debt cycle. This is caused because every time the short-term debt cycle finishes, it ends a little higher than where it started. This is because people are inclined to push it. They take too much debt. People see things up close. They don't see a 10-year view. So they don't know if they're reaching a peak or the economy is overheating. People continue to take debt because no one knows for certain when a recession is coming, when they are going to have to pay those debts back, when they have to sell their securities. Eventually, that debt catches up, and if it's bad, a deleveraging starts, which is when someone starts rapidly selling, or an economy starts rapidly selling things off to pay their debts. Deflation occurs, the liquidity trap kicks in, and a recession or even depression occurs. However, the economy does go back to normal, which we will learn more about later on in lesson 3. However, some good news. Today's lesson is done. Let's review. We covered GDP, GNI, and GNP. We also covered the expenditure approach, the income approach, and the value-added approach. Finally, we covered the short-term and long-term debt cycle. We covered a lot, but like anything we cover is all important, so rewatch the video or check out the links in the description if you didn't fully understand anything. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we will cover the circular flow model. See you later.